Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to go into the darkness of the caves and underground for this collection of scary stories. So buckle up and get your headlamps ready because it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. The state of New York is filled with paranormal activity. From Alcatraz Island to the Amityville Horror House, the Fox Sisters' home, and the Landmark Theatre. But in my small town, just outside of Syracuse, we have Whiskey Hollow Road. This incredibly narrow road has no lights and stretches for 5 miles. On one side of your vehicle is a seemingly endless tall hill covered in trees, and on the other side is a 30-foot drop into a ravine. So basically, if you have to make a 3-point turn on the street, you better be a professional stunt driver. The story goes like this. Back in the 50s, a married couple lived in a small shack on the end of the road. They were a seemingly normal couple. Through some speculated domestic issues and possibly infidelity, one day the husband came home to his wife's body collapsed on the floor in their home covered in blood and his shotgun by her side. The pain was too much, and not long after she was buried, the man took a rope to the opposite end of the street and let himself hang from the tree there. No matter what side you enter or exit the street, you're greeted by suicide. Through the years, there have been a few bodies discovered in the ravine, both with blunt trauma wounds and some seemingly clean, as if they just dropped dead and rolled down the hill to rest. In the middle of the road, about 2 miles in, is a small cave, which has long been speculated to be a site of some local ritualistic ceremonies, which could easily be dismissed, if not for the occasional bloody rag or other ominous item found inside. My story begins in 2010. I was in my junior year of high school, and my mother, a horror buff herself, was looking up some spooky places for a creepy road trip she wanted to take. She stumbled upon the Whiskey Hollow Road lore, and that night, my mother, my brother, a cousin, an aunt and I hopped into the minivan and drove the 15 minutes to the haunted street. I admit, I scoffed a little, being too cool for everything, punk kid, but I was intrigued enough to come, and I admit, when the van rolled up that tiny dirt road, my mood changed. I felt an immediate shift in energy as my mum crept the van into the entrance of the road. And here is where I need to stress just how dark this road is at night. Imagine the darkest place you've been, and go about 10 times darker than that. Headlights are barely useful, and honestly, you can see about 2 feet in front of your vehicle, even with your high beams on. Just before we rolled in, a pickup truck whipped around us and flew down the road, and I mean flew. He had to have been going at least 60 on the street, and realistically going at 20 would be risky. I fully expected to see his truck flip over in the ravine as we entered. The road is pitch black and shockingly quiet. You know when you used to play hide and seek and would hide in the closet or another small space, and you could hear your heart beating and your lungs making air for you? Yeah, it was that quiet. We shined flashlights through the trees as we passed, and we got our glimpse of the cave in real life. There's some dark energy in there, man. All in all, the drive was not terrifying. We made it to the end of the road, and just as we were about to clear the trees, a burst of light shot across our eyes. We squinted to see the pickup truck sitting at the end of the street facing us, as if it was waiting to see if we would make it out. We pulled out on the regular road, and this guy takes off down Whiskey Hollow again. To this day, I don't know how he did it. The next day, my mother was disappointed that nothing spooky happened and decided we head out in the daytime to see what the road looked like, all lit up. We rolled into the entrance, and yes, it was a lot less unsettling. But then again, isn't everything less scary when the lights are on? The silence was still there too, which shocked me a little bit. Not a bird or an owl, and I realized I never once saw any animal in those woods. which for upstate New York is quite odd. Usually in dense wood, you see a chipmunk or even a garden snake, but nothing. Mum decided to pull up to the cave, and we all got out to inspect it in the daylight. It wasn't as deep as we had imagined it would be, but there were some disturbing items inside. A small baby blanket with a suspicious stain, and a rattle with some colourful beads inside of it, some alcohol cans, and an old lighter. When I saw the blanket, I felt a knot in my stomach. My mum brushed it off, and we went on with the rest of our day. Fast forward to the senior year of high school. I was hanging out a lot with a cousin who was not only a bad influence, but didn't give me half a thought to anything paranormal. I, however, was getting into full baby witch mode this year. We were hanging out with a mutual friend one night and were bored. My cousin Marie says she wants to do something creepy. Our friend Kelly said she'd heard of a haunted road somewhere. I butt right in and give them the whole story of Whiskey Hollow, and we're off. The whole ride we're listening to music and having typical teenage fun. But the minutes we approached the cross street, it was like my body could sense the dark energy again. I was in the back seat and was playing it cool as we pulled up to the beginning of the road. But I felt the energy shift hard. It was sunset hour, so we had some light, but I knew our time was limited. We rolled through, and I reiterate the story again as we passed the trees. Marie is mocking everything and saying BS, but Kelly is listening as we approach the cave. She excitedly points at it, and we stop the car. As we approach the cave, the road is silent as usual, and our feet crunched the leaves, and it seemed to echo in the vast space. Marie walks straight into the cave. Like the horror movie cliché, she kicks the dirt, talking crap, just being your standard jerk. I tell her to chill, as she's being disrespectful to anyone who may have passed away in the area, which just fuels her, and she carries on being a dick. Kelly and I are just standing there watching her, and I open my mouth to ask her to stop. But then, without anyone touching us, both mine and Kelly's knees buckle, as if someone hit the back of our legs, and we fall into the grass. We whip around, terrified, fully expecting to see a deranged individual, but there was no one. Marie laughs at us for falling, and we insist that something pushed us, and we rub the grime from our jeans. Marie calls BS and heads back to the car. As she walks down the hill, Kelly and I try to figure out what the hell just happened and examine the rock, which was completely flat, so it's not like gravity took us down or we lost our footing. "Oh my god," Marie screams from the car. We race towards the vehicle and ask what happens. She fumbles for words, telling us to get in now. She says that when she opened the door, a bright white light dashed across the front of the car. It was too solid to be smoke, but not fully shaped to be a figure. I wonder for a split second if she was messing with us, but her face was pale and colourless. Marie had never looked like this. The genuine worry on her face was palpable. She hopped into the front seat, and I slid into the back. Marie started the car, and we pulled away. I couldn't help but give one last look to the cave. That's when I saw something. There was a figure crouched down at the top of the cave. It looked slender, was completely dark, like the Leatherman from American Horror Story, but very skinny. I thought I was crazy. And just as it started to stand, Kelly let out a blood-curdling scream from the seat. "Something's in the cave!" Marie floored the gas pedal, and we whipped it down the street. I was trying to come to terms with the fact that at least two of us saw an entity on that cave, and that it couldn't have been an actual person. There was no way. We would have seen someone at the top of the cave when we first approached. This wasn't a person. It was a thing. Marie shouted her mother's address into the car's GPS, and it began routing us away from the haunted road. Its navigation voice would chime in directions, and Marie turned and twisted as we tried to explain the figure we saw. The GPS then said, "Turned right." Marie was so frazzled from her own experience, and was avidly listening to ours, that she just turned without thinking. And when we looked out the window again, we were back at the top of Whiskey Hollow Road. The GPS brought us back again to the top of the road. We couldn't turn around. We had to drive down it again. "What's wrong with you?" Marie was glaring at me from the front seat. "What? Why are you acting like that?" I had no idea what she was talking about. Then I looked out the window and saw that we were parked at a pizza place in Marie's hometown. How did we get here? Marie then explained to me that for the entire ride back, I was silently giving her a death stare through the rearview mirror and wouldn't speak when she spoke to me. I would only smirk, and apparently on the highway I tried to open the door, fumbling with the lock and handle, but she had child lock on. I remembered none of it. From my point of view, we turned down Whiskey Hollow Road for the second time, and then I was sitting in a parking lot. I've thought for years about that occurrence, what it was all about, and the only thing I can think of is that when something noticed me when I first visited the place with my mother, and then when I returned with my cousin and friend, it recognized and latched onto me. Possibly. I refused to return to that place, and wonder if the entity that got inside me, the one that stood on top of the cave, was the same thing that drove the couple in the 50s to end their lives on either side of this scary road. I work as a cave guide and lead tours where we take people actual spelunking. Well, one day we take a group down in the cave and everyone's having a good time. We stop to take a break as part of the cave where you can hear the underground stream that flows through the cave. Well, we have everyone turn out their headlight where it's completely dark. It's very relaxing, letting the darkness take control. Then all of a sudden, we start hearing what sounds like people talking in front of us, and the sound of rocks being thrown into the water. The thing is, there's an about 100-foot drop in front of us, and the stream is at the bottom of that 100-foot drop. I've never heard anything like that before in the cave, and neither had the other guide that was with me. It's kind of creepy, but we decided it's just the sound of water sounding like voices, because sometimes if you listen long enough, the water may sound like muffled voices. However, I have never heard that noise coming from that particular spot. It's usually towards the right of where the stop is, which is why it was creepy that it was directly in front of us. So we continued and completed the tour, and after clearing up some of the gear, we decided to go record the noises on our phones. As we're going back into the cave, a different tour is coming out. The tour takes people on concrete trails through a different path of the cave, but they walk by where the spelunking tour begins. The guide of this tour looks at both of us and a little surprised and asked, "How did you get out so fast?" We're just like, "Dude, we've been out for an hour." He says that for his whole tour he could hear people talking back in the cave where the spelunking tour goes. Now everyone is kind of creeped out, and we have to call law enforcement officers to go look for people that may have snuck in the cave, but they never found anything or any evidence of anyone being there. In 2017, in December, a few days before Christmas, my best buddy and I decided to go to a West Virginia town that was about 90 minutes away from where we lived. We found a way to a popular trail in our state, and we wound up hiking for 25 miles on the whole, crossing through 2 counties. Well, along the way, we encountered a number of long, abandoned tunnels that had been used for the railroads back in the day. One of the tunnels was especially long and dark, and as we moved through the blackness, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched by something or someone. I keep wishing to myself that we make it out of this tunnel soon, and eventually we do. Well, for some reason, I'm compelled to look back at the tunnel, and I saw something that caused me to freeze up where I stood. In the darkness, I could see the figure of a woman standing there. She had dark hair and wore a dress that appeared to be from the 1800s. Her face was pale as death, and she was looking right at me. I started freaking out and pointing out to her to my friend, but by the time I did, she was gone and had vanished without a trace. This guy is a good buddy of mine, and we both had our share of odd experiences. I guess that's the reason I'm sharing this, because afterwards I came to discover that that particular tunnel system we were using was noted by folks to be haunted. The chief ghost, a woman in white. They call her the Woman of Silver Run Tunnel, because apparently in the summer of 1865, the Silver Run Tunnel endured a rock collapse which killed 3 men and seriously injured a lone woman. Her fate was not disclosed, but in 1940, a woman's skeleton with long dark hair and a white dress was discovered to be in the walls of an abandoned house near the tunnels. Reportedly, for a period after the discovery of the body, the sightings of the mysterious woman in the tunnels stopped. These are the only instances of traumatic experience involving a woman and the Silver Run tunnels that I could find, and I would assume at least one of them would be correct. Honestly, the experience was so bizarre, but it's definitely something I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my days. This happened in France when I was hiking the Haute Route between Chamonix and Zermatt back in 2015, and myself and another hiking buddy had set up our tents after a big day, and we were exploring the rocky landscape around the hut. There was a big concrete opening like a warehouse cut into the rock that caught my eye, and we grabbed our head torches and walked in. At the end of the chamber was a large tunnel that sloped down into the mountains, just wide enough for a car, but with small streams running down the sides and our voices echoing down forever. We kept walking into the blackness for a few hundred meters until we heard a faint engine sound and pinpoints of light. Suddenly dawning on us that a vehicle was approaching, we found a side tunnel and hid while the vehicle passed. The side tunnel was even more creepy and had old cans and rubbish lying around from the 60s. It seemed as we wanted to avoid being caught in the road tunnel again, we just kept going through this passage. As unlikely as it seemed, we saw faint moonlight ahead and had to squeeze through a gap in the concrete to take us outside on the side of the mountain, where there was a thin path back to the track. It was definitely an interesting experience. While I was stationed in Germany, my friend and I used to go sightseeing. We were always briefed to stay on the beaten path, but no one really did that. We decided to go exploring some of the castles along the Rhine River during the winter, not knowing that most of the sites were closed. We were very disappointed, but we still ended up finding some pretty good sights. On our way out of a town near Oberwiesel, we ended up just taking a random road out into the country. We kept driving until eventually we saw a dirt road running parallel to the highway. We decided to find where it started and see where it ended up. We finally found the start of a small road. It was one lane and it was a dirt road, and we continued up it a bit before we came across a sign. We were trained to recognize most of the signs, but we had very little German language experience and we had never seen this sign before. One thing we did know was the universal skull and crossbones that was prominently displayed. We tried to do a Google search, but we had no cell reception. We had to talk of turning around, but after a bit we agreed to see where it ended up. We ended up driving almost a mile into a forest before we came across this huge door that was built into the side of a hill. We were slowly driving by when we noticed that while the door wasn't open, we could still get inside. The door was almost 6 inches thick and made of steel. The opening was caused by the door literally being off its hinges. More discussion took place before we decided to see what was inside. Armed with only our cell phones for light and a small hatchet, we made our way inside, only to discover that our cell phones illuminated exactly nothing. We were in a cave, a huge, pitch-black room. I picked up a rock and threw it as hard as I could. The rock hit the floor much further in. We would have went deeper, but we were starting to get the feeling that we were being watched, and we ended up getting out of there as fast as we could. which wasn't that fast considering that my friend's car refused to start. It was a grade A horror movie setup which resolved after my friend's crappy car finally started. If I ever go back out to Germany, I plan on visiting it again, but I can't for the life of me find the area on Google Maps anymore. 12 to 15 years ago, some friends and I were caving in Kentucky. This was probably our 4th or 5th visit to this cave. We did some climbing and made a few ill-advised jumps on muddy ledges and finally found a dead-end passage that had a long, abandoned campsite in it. There was a sleeping bag, some cans of sardines, a bunch of batteries, and some cans of Coke, with the Holiday Santa off them. At first we thought, oh man, we're in someone's camp, we better get out of here. Then I noticed that the date on the camp was 8 to 10 years earlier. We searched around to make sure nobody had gotten lost or trapped nearby and died, and then we left. I cannot express how creepy it is to find something like this so far underground. The cave is relatively well known, and a pretty good map exists. Between the existing map and our experience, we could navigate the cave easily. But the passage in question is not on the map. We later made to visit that cave, but were never able to find that passage again. At best, we could tell that someone who knew of the cave took shelter there during winter and then abandoned their camp. The location was too far into the cave for convenient access to the surface, and it didn't appear that they had been in that spot for very long. Maybe they were hiding. We'll never know. Just a public service note here, you really need to know what you're doing and to be properly prepared for caving. It's really fun and challenging, but really bad things can happen underground. If you're interested in caving, learn how to do it right from the National Speleological Society grotto. Don't go into caves unprepared. Things can go very wrong, and it could end up being the last thing you ever do. An unsettlingly large tunnel system in the woods that might have a dead body in it. You see, I used to live in Vermont, in a house that backed up to the woods. I liked to play in there. Well, I have this really bad habit of exploring draining and sewer systems because it's fun. When I discovered this system in particular, with a friend, it hit me up as odd due to the sheer size. This was a small town we're in, and nothing there would justify such a large concrete tunnel in the woods. My friend wanted to explore it, and I definitely wanted to explore it. We made it about a mile in, when the smell hit us. It was freaking disgusting. Being 7, we choked it up to sewage, until we saw the lumps of something with bugs all over it. That, dear strangers, is when I realized I'd messed up, and we ran away, and fast. I didn't sleep for about a week. We never told our parents about it. You think my love for exploring these things would have stopped there, but it didn't. And sometimes in the dead of night, I wonder if it was a person there, and if their body is still there, all these years later, skeletal remains lying there, forgotten. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened. One weekend I was visiting my grandparents, who at the time lived in the countryside. I'm from Bosnia, in Europe. They were only about an hour's drive away, and we went there early in the morning. Their house is in a wooded area, with a long winding road that led up to each individual house, of which there weren't many, perhaps 3 or 4 more. I knew the area well, since I went to visit almost every weekend. Beside going up to the houses, there is one section of the road that leads directly into the woods on a sort of natural trail. Our car broke down exactly around that spot, flat tire. Since we were very close to where my grandparents live, and my folks knew I was familiar with the area, they let me go on a walk while my dad fixed the tire. It was around 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning, so they weren't really afraid to let me run around a bit. Being the curious kid that I was, I went into the forest trail since the main dirt road wasn't very exciting. The trees were very tall and dense, so even during the daytime it was kind of dark. I went up to the forest trail for a few hundred meters in until I came to a crossroads. Now, this was more than 20 years ago, but it left a lasting impression on me. In the middle of the crossroads, at the very point in the roads where they fork, there is a strange opening of a cave. I went a bit closer and noticed what appeared to be fireflies sparkling in the pitch-dark hole. Beside that, I just felt this presence, as if I wasn't alone there, as if the cavern was beckoning me to enter. And then I noticed what seemed like several pairs of small red eyes peering at me from the darkness. At this point I was quite spooked, thinking it was an animal of some kind, and decided not to go any further in and just slowly back away. This is in Southeast Europe. There aren't many dangerous animals around. Very rarely a wolf or bear would be sighted, but usually nowhere near human settlements. Nothing followed me, and I had no trouble getting back, and I decided not to tell my parents about it since I figured they would be mad and would not let me play unsupervised for the remainder of our visit. They decided to leave me with my grandparents and pick me up on Monday when they went back during the afternoon. I'm very close with my grandmother. She and I are very alike, especially now as a grown-up, so I told her about the encounter. She laughed it off, saying, "Honey, there's nothing in there." I walk there every day, but I was adamant about what I saw, and she agreed that we would go for a walk together and visit that spot. It wasn't far from her house, and we arrived there that same afternoon. We got to the crossroads, and like she said, there was nothing there. No burrow/cave, just a flat spot where the crossroads met. No traces of it being dug up or buried. Grandma even asked me, "Are you sure it was here?" And I replied yes. She didn't think too much of it, chalking it up to a childish imagination, but she told me not to venture out there on my own again. We continued our walk, and I just stopped mentioning the event from then on out. But to this day, even all these years later, I still remember it quite vividly. I even find it strange I'm able to recall the details, and of course, I know memories can be distorted over time, and that we think we remember, but it may not always be the full picture since our brain fills in the blanks. But I don't feel like it was the case with this. I often contemplate what would have happened had I stepped closer, or worse, tried to enter the dark cave. I have read about evil places in forests around the world, or places where time and space can be warped somewhat. People walking into what they describe as a different timeline, or other dimension. Maybe this was one of those places. My grandparents don't live there anymore. Grandpa passed away when I was 16, and my grandma moved to the city in the same building as me and my folks. We still own the house and land there, but I haven't been back in years. My dad goes to clean up and check things a few times a year. According to him, the house and land have almost been consumed by the vegetation. They cut the water and electricity so they wouldn't pay the bills, so it's not convenient going. But I do plan going there at some point, perhaps during my next time off or vacation from work. I really want to go back to the road, just to see if I feel anything. And now that I'm an adult with an interest in the paranormal, maybe I'll have some kind of revelation when I get there. One of my most tactile paranormal experiences were in the underground catacombs under the Scottish city of Edinburgh. I was there with my family on a ghost tour, and certainly felt like I got my money's worth, even if I was a little too primed to be totally objective. I can always separate fact from fantasy. The vaults have been occupied by a variety of less than desirable people through the years. It's not a stretch to imagine murders and debauchery. It looked and felt like a dank dungeon. Anyway, as we walked through the vaults, I was hanging back, but there were usually a few people behind me in the tour group at all times. I felt noticeable temperature drops at several different points, which was unusual because the place should have had a stable cellar temperature. Near the end of the tour, I felt a cool breeze and a hand on my shoulder. I could feel the pressure from the individual finger. I looked back expecting to see my dad or someone, but it appeared that I had fallen to the very back of the tour. No one was there. It didn't really cause any strong emotional reaction at the time, but I often think back to that moment. This was probably my most palpable physical experience, but by no means the most poignant. Anyway, I'm wondering if anyone else has had any experiences in this place or somewhere similar. I would love to hear your thoughts. I work as a child care professional, and one of the kids that I looked after had recently gotten into hiking. I decided to take him to a really cool trail in Salt Fort State Park, where we were all set to hike to Hosak's cave after parking right near the beginning of the trailhead. The entire trail is about half a mile, which is why I chose this trail for our hike that day. I also chose this trail because any time I had been on it before, it was very busy and full of people, and a very popular spot which made me feel secure. However, this past summer, we had a cluster of several summer storms which caused massive damage to the trail. So to my surprise, it was much more difficult and completely empty. I wasn't bothered by the trail being obviously empty, because there was a small construction crew working on a bridge that was just barely visible from the trailhead. He was still up for the hike, despite the entire width of the trail being washed out until it was no more than a foot wide, with a 6 to 12 foot drop into a creek bed that is solid rock and several trees down. He is very athletic, and I was confident in his abilities, and he was so excited to tackle our adventure. We made it all the way to the platform that allows you to see the entire cave. There were many downed trees surrounding the platform, and it was actually closed at this point, but we had made it this far, so we decided to maneuver around the platform and proceeded that few hundred feet into the cave. We spent the most time in this area due to the difficulty, so I know exactly what it looked like. There were tree roots directly under the platform, and you could climb down on either side. It's also worth noting that Hosak's cave is much more like a cliff, with an overhanging rock formation and a trickle of waterfall directly in the middle. It's not a creepy closed-up cave, it's open and beautiful. We got to the cave and I noticed a candle that was not burning recently, but had at some point been sitting on a large rock that had a heart carved into it. I chalked it up to someone having a date or something and disregarded it. He wanted to climb to the top, where I noticed 2 more candles and 3 stacks of small rocks that had been stacked up by somebody. I definitely felt weird at this point, because it was about this time that he found a small puddle full of baby salamanders and wanted to catch them. It was the happiest I'd seen him in a very long time, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that it was time to go. So we spent about an hour catching baby salamanders, and I watched him have the time of his life. We finally decided to leave when we got to the platform. Dead center in the middle of the tree roots was a wet washcloth, hanging, that was absolutely not there before. He noticed it as well, but did not pick up the severity of the situation we were in. At that moment, I factually knew 2 things. Someone was watching us, and we did not see them, and they were now potentially hiding in the woods, and made it a point to not be seen but to leave an object to be noticed. There was no running back to the narrow trail, and I was not going to tell him that we might have been in danger. I told him to go in front of me, and just kept encouraging him that he was doing great over and over, and that seemed to speed him up naturally. I never saw anyone while we were on the trail. We got to the car and I locked the doors immediately. On our way out of the park, a very dirty man in his 30s came out of the woods and made it a point to stare at me with the most empty expression I've ever seen. The man followed me with his eyes and head as I drove by him, and continued to stare at me until I couldn't see him anymore. I knew the third fact at that point. He made it a point to make himself apparent to me, and that fact 1 and fact 2 were true. That scare stuck with me for days, and I considered counseling after it, as it scared and bothered me for several weeks, giving me anxiety. I tried to tell myself perhaps we were just interrupting his bath time and he was camped and didn't want to startle us. After all, the crazy-looking man had ample time to do anything he wanted while we were catching salamanders. I just cannot in any way rationalize why he stared into my eyes the way he did, as if he wanted to go unnoticed. Deep down, I know that it's much more likely that it was a deliberate action intending to scare me. He never had any idea how panicked, and to this day it was the most fun I've ever seen him have. He brings it up regularly, and it was a very positive experience for him. It was one of the worst experiences ever, and it made me feel so sick and disturbed. I was in Edinburgh with a few friends, and we had booked one of these tours around the old town that takes you through the underground vaults. Towards the end of the underground vaults tour, I was at the back of the group and peeked into one of the rooms where there was a man just casually leaning against a wall, one foot propped up against the wall, arms folded. His clothes looked quite old too. I couldn't really recall much about him other than that, as initially I thought maybe he was an actor who was just going to come out behind us and scare us, so I quickly popped my head back out and continued on without saying another word. At the end of the tour though, I don't remember anyone coming up behind us, and it didn't really seem like that kind of tour to begin with. Some people have suggested the guy may have just been on his lunch break, but what got to me was that he was just in the vaults by himself, leaning against a wall in the dark. It seemed a bit odd to me. Maybe a ghost, maybe not, but I do wonder who it was and why he was there. This happened during a tour of the Edinburgh catacombs. I'll start off by saying that I was just abroad in England back in the fall of 2017 studying, and my friends and I went to Edinburgh for a weekend trip to explore and sightsee. One of my friends looked online and we found out that 1, Edinburgh was very haunted, and 2, they had ghost tours, so we picked one that was the cheapest as we were on a college budget. It started off pretty chill. The tour was super nice and friendly. We walked around above ground, saw where the longest hanging took place in Edinburgh and other haunted places. But then we learnt that there were catacombs in certain places, and the tour would take us into one. I never knew Edinburgh had catacombs or vaults, and I was shocked and excited. I can't remember the exact place where we went, but we climbed down these stairs into a giant, cavernous space. It was dark, and with some lanterns, creepy as hell environment, and our tour guide explained how people have seen different ghosts and how most are friendly, but one is extremely mean and terrible. She said people have actually screamed and left. None that happened to me or my friends on the tour, but the entire time we were down there, I remember the back of my neck got really cold, like winter level cold. And when we went to parts where people saw the particularly mean spirits, I would feel bad vibes and the need to get out. I didn't though. I just stayed in the middle of the group and took deep breaths, and eventually when we left I felt better. When we got out we talked about the experience, and one of my friends, Nick, who was on the far edge of the group against the wall, felt worse than me. He felt his entire body get cold and started shivering. He said at one point he felt something grab his hand in the room where people saw the spectre and thought he heard whispering. We were the only two to get affected during the entire tour among our friends. This story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my dad. Years ago, when he was about 17, him and his first girlfriend decided to go on a little hike in the forest behind their town. It was rumored that there was a cave at the very end of the forest where it opened up on a small hill. They decided to go together one afternoon as they were bored during summer break. They were going to have a picnic right outside the cave to see if it was real and take a picture on a Polaroid with them in front to prove that they had been to their friends as a challenge of adolescence. They made their way through the forest and it seemed simple enough. There was nothing really there to stop them making their way, aside from a particularly nasty bush at one point. My dad says that it was very awkward, the conversation between the two, as even though he'd known and liked the girl for a while, he still wasn't really sure what they should be talking about, and she was in the same boat. But nonetheless, they made the best of it, in near silence as they walked along the path. Within about half an hour of walking, they made it to the cave entrance. It was a lot spookier than he had thought. He'd never actually been this far in the forest, and he looked up at the ominous opening in the hill. In order to reach it, they would have to scramble up a small amount of the hill to get to the opening, which is something that she wasn't prepared to do, as she wasn't really wearing appropriate attire that she wanted to get dirty. My dad, on the other hand, felt emboldened by her presence and wanted to explore to appear brave or something, in his words. So, Polaroid at the ready, they snapped a picture with the mouth of the cave perfectly visible in the shot. She told him that she would wait right there, and up he went into the cave to have a little poke around. He said that first, the thing that impacted him the most was the smell. He'd never really been in a cave before, and the stench of damp and rot invaded his nostrils instantly. He pushed through the dark and grimy cave and had a look around the parts he could see. It was a fairly long and open space. He couldn't determine how far it went in, but it had been clear that it was at least partially man-made on the inside, with an effort to excavate a tunnel further back being apparent. How long it had been used for or disused for is another matter, but he stared in awe at the cave. Part of him wanted to go forward, willing himself to explore just to see what treasures and or horrors lied further down, but another part of him told him it best not to go. He heeded the side of caution, and after standing there for a good long while, decided it would be best to go back. Right as he was making his way down the scramble of the hill, he felt something push his back. That caused him to fall unceremoniously right near the foot of the girl. He had actually hurt his head pretty badly and wasn't feeling too good. They made haste back towards his parents' house to be seen to. It left a gnarly cut on his forehead, and after a few days when it was healing up, the girl came back to show him the picture that they had taken on their little outing, after it had been shown to all the friends. She was a bit hesitant at first, because she said that some of her friends said they saw something up near the mouth of the cave. It being a Polaroid and a very small picture, and the cave being in the background, it was hard to determine what this small bundle of pixels could be, but to some people, it looked like a face poking out from behind the cave. Whether it was a phantom that pushed my dad, we will never know, but he has long since left the town and has no intention of going back since to find out. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope, as always, that you enjoyed. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you sign up, you occasionally get bonus content, and in September, I'm going to have plenty more of it for you. So you've got something to look forward to. But until then, there's more videos on screen if you are so inclined. Thank you all for watching. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.